The air was cold that morning, sharp enough to cut through the mist that wrapped around the tiny frontier town like a ghostly blanket. Men gathered at the old sawmill clearing, voices low, boots stamping against frozen ground. It was auction day, not for timber or cattle, but for something darker, stranger. The widows and the desperate stood behind a line of rough-hewn tables, faces veiled or heads bowed. No one looked happy to be there. Not even the men bidding. Among them stood a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and lonely eyes, Elias Boone. A lumberjack by trade, a hermit by choice. His cabin sat miles deep in the forest, far from town, far from the noise of people who reminded him of what he'd lost. His wife, Mary, had died 5 winters ago in childbirth, and he'd buried his heart beside her grave. He didn't come to buy a wife. He came for lumber nails. But the crowd had pulled him in like a current, and before he knew it, he was standing there, watching as a frail woman with a sack tied over her head was led onto the stage. Next one, the auctioneer barked, his voice flat. Unknown woman. Says she can work, cook, and stay silent. $2 starting bid. Silence fell. $2 was too much for a mystery no man wanted. The sack covered her face entirely, tied at the neck with coarse rope. Her hands, pale and trembling, clutched a small burlap sack of her own. No one spoke, no one moved. Until Elias did. He reached into his pocket, pulled out 2 worn bills, and held them up. $2. The crowd murmured. Someone snorted. Boone's gone mad. Buy-in, a ghost wife now. The auctioneer smirked. Sold to the lumberjack. The woman didn't look up. Didn't speak. Elias walked forward, the weight of pity heavy on his shoulders. He didn't know why he did it, maybe because no one else would. Maybe because the silence in his cabin had grown too loud. He led her back to his horse-drawn cart. She sat in the back, still holding that sack tight. Not a word passed between them during the long ride through snow and pine. When they reached his cabin, he built a fire, poured her some stew, and sat across the table. The sack stayed on her head. You can take that off, he said softly. She shook her head. All right, he murmured. You can keep it on. Don't matter to me. Days turned to weeks. She worked quietly, cooking, cleaning, mending his shirts. She never spoke. Not once. But she moved with grace, as though she'd once known a better life. At night, Elias heard her humming faintly to herself, a tune he couldn't place, something sorrowful but soft. He tried not to care. But the loneliness that had lived in his chest began to shift, like frost thawing after a long winter. Then, one night, a blizzard hit. The wind screamed through the trees, the roof groaned under snow, and Elias found her sitting by the fire, staring at the flames. Why don't you talk? He asked quietly. Her hands twisted together. You wouldn't want to know. I wouldn't have asked if I didn't. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice fragile as ice cracking. My name is Clara. Elias froze. That name. He hadn't heard it in years, not since the fire that took the neighboring farm, where the preacher's daughter, Clara, had vanished. He leaned forward slowly. Clara who? Her hands shook. She reached up, untied the rope, and pulled off the sack. The firelight caught her face, burned scars across one cheek, fading into smoother skin, eyes a deep hazel filled with fear and sadness. She looked older, but unmistakable. Clara Mayfield, she whispered. Elias's breath hitched. You're supposed to be dead. She gave a faint smile. Supposed to be. He stared, his chest heavy with disbelief. You were the one from the Mayfield place, the one. They said ran into the fire for your mother. She nodded, tears welling. I tried to save her. I didn't make it out in time. When they pulled me out, they thought I was someone else. I woke up in a stranger's wagon, face burned, name gone. I wandered until I had nothing left. The auction was the end of the road. The room went quiet but for the wind outside. Elias's throat tightened. He saw the woman before him, not a stranger, but someone the world had forgotten. Someone who had been through hell and still had the strength to stand. You should have told me sooner, he said softly. Would it have mattered? He paused. Maybe not. The days that followed were different. Clara spoke more, slowly at first, like remembering how to use her voice. She told him about the years she'd spent hiding from pity, from the looks, from herself. And Elias found himself listening, really listening, for the first time in years. He showed her the woods, the trails he'd cut with his axe, the little pond where the moonlight glowed like silver. She began to smile again. And when she laughed, truly laughed, it filled the cabin with something that had been missing since Mary died: life. One morning, spring thaw dripping from the roof, Elias came in from the forest with a small bouquet of wildflowers, awkwardly arranged, stems uneven. He placed them on the table beside her bowl. "What's this?" she asked, a faint smile tugging her lips. "Payment," he said, half joking. "For all the cookin' and mendin' you done." She shook her head. "You already paid $2. He chuckled. "That was the best $2 I ever spent." The look in his eyes silenced her smile. Something deep and quiet passed between them, recognition, maybe, or healing. He reached across the table, his rough hand covering hers. "Clara," he said softly. "Would you stay? Not as help, not as someone I bought, but as my wife." Her eyes widened. "You'd have me, like this." "Like this," he said. "Exactly this." She stared at him for a long time, tears pooling in her eyes, then whispered, "Yes." They married that summer in the clearing behind the cabin, beneath the whispering pines. No preacher, no guests, just two people who'd both been burned by life, finding warmth again in each other. Years later, when travelers passed through those woods, they spoke of the lumberjack and his scarred wife, the woman who sang at sunrise, the man who smiled again after years of silence. And sometimes, when the wind swept through the trees, it carried her soft humming across the valley, a song of survival, of love that grew from ashes. Elias would listen from his porch, his hands rough with years of work, and think of that cold morning long ago, when he'd paid $2 for a woman with a sack on her head. And ended up buying back his heart. Elias Boone never thought much about fate, yet after that day at the auction, he began to wonder if fate had always been watching him from the shadows of the pines. The kind of wondering that creeps in when the nights are long, the wind whispers through the chinks of the cabin walls, and you realize how small you are against the endless wilderness. The morning after their quiet wedding, Elias woke before dawn, as he always did. The forest outside was thick with fog, every pine needle dripping with dew. He split wood behind the cabin, his axe biting into the logs with clean, steady rhythm. When he turned, he saw Clara standing in the doorway, wrapped in a wool shawl. Her hair, now grown longer, shimmered faintly in the weak light of the rising sun. "Breakfast's on the stove," she called, her voice soft but stronger than before. He smiled, wiping his brow. "Smells better than any meal I've had since," he stopped himself before finishing the sentence. "Since Mary." Clara didn't ask him to. She simply nodded, understanding what he hadn't said. That was how they were, two people who didn't need many words. After breakfast, she joined him outside, her small hands busy gathering kindling, her face brightened by the fresh air. Elias noticed how her scars caught the sunlight, the way they seemed less harsh than before. He never looked away from them. The first few times, she'd flinched under his gaze, expecting pity or revulsion. But there was none. One day, she asked, "You don't mind how I look?" He set down his axe, leaned it against the chopping block, and looked straight at her. "You think scars make you less? I got scars too, just ain't where folks can see 'em." That silenced her, not with shame, but with understanding. By spring, the forest came alive again. The sound of rushing meltwater filled the air, and the scent of pine mixed with wildflowers that crept along the forest floor. Clara began tending to a small garden behind the cabin. She planted herbs, potatoes, carrots, and beans, her hands finding life in the dirt. Elias built her a small fence to keep the deer out, carving the posts himself. Sometimes he'd pause his work and watch her kneeling in the soil, her skirt brushing the ground, the wind playing in her hair. She'd hum that same tune she used to hum when she was silent, the one that carried both sorrow and hope. "You sing that every day," he said once. "What's it called?" She smiled faintly. "It doesn't have a name. It's something my mother used to hum while she cooked. I don't remember the words, just the sound." He nodded. "Then keep hummin' it. It makes the place feel alive." Summer brought warmth and long days. Elias took her into the forest, teaching her to fish and find wild berries. They'd sit by the river, the water glinting under the afternoon sun, their laughter mingling with the murmur of the current. But not every day was easy. The scars of the past didn't vanish with time, they lingered like ghosts. Clara had nightmares sometimes. She'd wake up screaming, sweat dripping down her temples, crying out for her mother. Elias would wake instantly, pulling her close, whispering that she was safe. She'd tremble in his arms until her breathing slowed, her head resting against his chest. Once, she said in a broken whisper, "Sometimes I can still smell the smoke. I see her reaching for me, I couldn't save her." Elias stroked her hair gently. "You did what you could, Clara. Some things are bigger than us. You survived. That counts for something." In the quiet that followed, the fire crackled softly, and the warmth between them became something steady, something real. The next morning, Clara cooked his favorite stew. She didn't say it aloud, but it was her way of saying thank you. That summer turned into autumn, and the woods exploded in color: amber, crimson, gold. Elias and Clara spent their evenings sitting on the porch, sipping cider, watching the light fade between the trees. The loneliness that once filled the cabin had melted away, replaced by the warmth of her laughter and the scent of bread baking in the oven. When he went to town for supplies, people noticed the change. Elias, who had once walked through town like a ghost, now greeted the blacksmith, helped the general store owner carry crates, and even tipped his hat at strangers. Old Mr. Tully, the barkeep, called out, "Boone, heard you finally found yourself a missus." "That true?" Elias smiled faintly. "True enough. What's she like?" Elias paused, then said, "She's quiet, but strong. Like a pine tree in winter." Tully chuckled. "Never thought I'd see the day Elias Boone spoke poetry." Elias just smiled and loaded his cart. But word travels fast in small towns, and soon people began whispering. Some said he'd bought himself a wife like a man buys a horse. Others said she was cursed, that her scars were punishment for sins unknown. Clara felt their stares whenever she ventured into town. She kept her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes downcast. One afternoon, as they left the general store, a group of women whispered near the well. "That's her," one murmured. "The one with the burned face." Clara's steps faltered. Elias noticed, turned sharply, and the look he gave those women made them fall silent. When they got back to the wagon, Clara said softly, "You shouldn't have done that. It'll only make them talk more." "Let 'em talk," he said, his voice firm. "Ain't there words that build our home?" She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time, he saw a light in her eyes, something fierce and alive. The following winter tested them both. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, and supplies ran low. The nights stretched long, and the cold crept through even the thickest blankets. Elias fell ill with fever 1 week, too weak to chop wood or hunt. Clara tended to him day and night, wiping his forehead, coaxing him to drink broth, whispering prayers into the dark. When he finally woke one morning, weak but alive, he found her asleep beside the bed, her head resting on his arm. His heart swelled with something deeper than gratitude, something that felt like destiny. As he recovered, Clara smiled more easily. She'd taken over his chores, learned to mend tools, even swung his axe once when he couldn't. The sight made him laugh until his sides ached. "You'll outwork me soon," he teased. "Maybe I already do," she replied, eyes sparkling. By spring, Elias was back on his feet, stronger than before. The first thing he built was a new cabin window, larger than the one before, letting in the golden morning light Clara loved so much. She decorated the sill with small wildflowers and smooth river stones. The cabin began to look less like a refuge and more like a home. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Clara turned to him and said quietly, "Elias, I've been thinking. Maybe we could go to town and have a proper marriage blessing. I want it to be real, not just for us, but before God." He nodded slowly. "If that's what you want, I'll do it." So they did. The town preacher, old Reverend Silas, married them proper that Sunday morning. Only a handful of people attended: Mr. Tully, the blacksmith, and 2 kind women who had always defended Clara. The preacher's words were simple, but his eyes kind. "Love is not found in beauty," he said, "but in mercy. And mercy is the language of the heart." When they exchanged vows, Clara's voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. Elias's rough hand held hers like it was something sacred. Afterward, the townsfolk didn't whisper so much anymore. Some even smiled at her in passing. The world, it seemed, had softened a little. Years rolled by like the seasons. Their home grew, and so did their life. They built a barn, kept chickens, even planted apple trees. Every autumn, they'd gather baskets of apples, pressing them into cider together. One crisp evening, Elias found Clara sitting by the riverbank, staring at her reflection. He sat beside her and handed her a red apple. "You ever think about going back?" he asked. She smiled sadly. "Back where? There's nothing left of that life. This is where I belong." He nodded. "Reckon you're right." Then she said softly, "You know, Elias, the night of that fire, I prayed for someone to find me. Not to save me, just to see me. I think God took his time, but he answered." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "And I prayed for someone to bring me back to life. Guess he answered both of us." In the years that followed, they grew older together. The cabin weathered storms and summers alike, their laughter echoing through the trees. The townsfolk came to know Clara not as the woman with the sack, but as the kind lady who sold herbs and baked the best bread in the valley. Sometimes, when travelers came through the woods, they'd ask about the story of the lumberjack who bought a wife for $2. Elias would just grin and say, that was a fair price for eternity. When the snow fell thick and white each winter, Clara would sit by the fire and hum her mother's tune. Elias would close his eyes and listen, feeling peace like he never had before. They never had children, but their love filled the cabin so fully that no space felt empty. When he worked outside, he'd glance toward the window and see her face framed in the light, waiting for him with that small, gentle smile. As the years passed, Elias's beard turned silver, and Clara's hair shimmered white. Her scars faded, though he'd always say they were beautiful, like rivers on a map that led him home. One spring morning, long after their wedding, the first apple tree they'd planted bloomed for the first time. White blossoms filled the air with sweetness. Clara laughed when she saw it, clapping her hands like a child. "Look, Elias, it finally bloomed." He smiled, wrapping his arm around her. "Took its time, just like us." And when she leaned her head against his shoulder, he felt the steady beat of her heart, a rhythm that matched his own. Years later, when Elias grew too old to swing his axe, Clara read to him by the fire. Old stories, scripture, or sometimes just her own memories. He'd listen, eyes closed, his rough hand resting in hers. One night, she whispered, "You never told me what made you raise your hand at that auction." "Why me, Elias?" He opened his eyes and said softly, "I don't rightly know. Maybe it wasn't me raising my hand at all. Maybe it was something greater, saying, this one's for you." Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled. "You saved me that day." He shook his head gently. "No, Clara, you saved me." When the next winter came, it was harsh and long. Elias's health began to fade. One night, as snow drifted outside, he lay in bed, his breath shallow. Clara sat beside him, holding his hand. "Clara," he whispered, "remember that day I paid $2? She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Best bargain a man ever made," he murmured, his thumb brushing her palm. "Promise me you'll keep hummin' that song. Don't stop." "I promise," she whispered. His hand went still, the warmth fading slowly, and the cabin filled with silence. Outside, the pines swayed gently, their branches heavy with snow. Clara stayed beside him for a long time, her tears falling silently. Then she began to hum, that same wordless tune, trembling at first, then stronger, carrying through the cabin, through the trees, into the night. Seasons turned again. The townsfolk still spoke of Elias Boone, the kind lumberjack who lived deep in the forest. But when they spoke of Clara, they spoke of her light. She kept the cabin as it was, tending the garden, caring for the apple trees. Each morning, she'd sit by the porch, watching the mist rise over the pines. Sometimes, she'd talk aloud to him, as though he were just out splitting wood. "You'd laugh to see the foxes playin' near the fence," she'd say. "They're gettin' bold." Her hair was silver now, her hands frail, but her spirit strong as ever. When spring returned again, the apple tree bloomed more than ever before, white blossoms shining like snowflakes against blue sky. She sat beneath it, humming softly, her song drifting into the still air. And when the sun dipped low, painting the forest gold, it almost looked as if Elias was there beside her, smiling, listening, just as he used to. Years later, travelers would find that old cabin still standing, the apple tree still blooming, and if they listened closely at dusk, they'd swear they could hear a faint humming in the wind, soft, steady, full of love. They said it was Clara's song, still echoing through the trees. And those who knew the story would smile and say that $2 once bought more than a woman. It bought a second chance, a redemption, and a love that time itself couldn't bury.